So as I mentioned, we have this React context concept, which allows us to manage state kind of behind the scenes in React, such that we actually are able to directly change it from any component in our app and directly pass it to any component in our app without building such a prop chain. For that, here in my source folder, next to my components folder, I will add a new folder, context, and you don't have to name it context. You could also name it state or store. Often such an app-wide state is also named store, so maybe let's go with that. And in there, I'll add a new file. And since we're going to manage some authentication state, I will add a auth context in there. So hence, I will name the file authcontext.js. The exact naming is up to you though. You could also name it auth context like this, so in this Pascal case notation, but this would imply that we're going to store a component in there, and that's not directly what we're doing. Hence, I'll go for this naming using kebab case. So auth context.js, and I can say right away, you can have multiple contexts for multiple global states in your app. And of course, you can also use just one context for a bigger state. That's all up to you, but let's maybe just learn how context works. So we get the auth context.js file. And in there, we import React from React as if we would build a component, but we're not going to do that. Instead, on React, I'm going to call create context. And this does what the name implies. It creates such a context object in the end. Now, create context takes a default context. And context here really is just your app or component-wide state. So it's up to you what that state should be. It could be something simple like just a string, my state. If your app-wide or component-wide state is just some text, you could have some, well, text as your default state. Often though, it will be an object. It will be an object where you, for example, in our case, manage the isLoggedIn state and set this to false initially, let's say. Now, what we get back from create context is something interesting though. It will be a component, or it will be an object that also contains components. Let's put it like this. So we get back auth context, and I'll name it like this because whilst auth context itself is not a component, it is an object that will contain a component. Now, we don't need this object here though. Instead, we'll need it in the other components. So I'll export it as a default to make it available in other files. So now we can import this specific context object. And to then use context in your app, you need to do two things. You need to provide it, which basically tells React, hey, here's my context. All components that are wrapped by it should have access to it. And I'll come back to that wrapping part in a second. And besides providing, you then need to consume it. You need to hook into it. You need to listen to it, if you want to call it like this. Now, providing is always the first step. Providing means that you wrap in JSX code all the components that should be able to tap into that context, so that should be able to listen to that context. Any component that's not wrapped will not be able to listen. So here, if we know that we need this context everywhere in the entire application, so in all components possibly, we want to wrap everything in app component with it. If we knew that we only needed, let's say, in the login component and its child components, we could only wrap the login component. But here we'll need it in the main header, we'll need it down there, we'll need it everywhere. So therefore, we can wrap our main header and this main section with auth context, and for that we'll need to import it. So make sure you add this import from store auth context to import this auth context object. And I said that this itself wouldn't be a component. In JSX, we need a component though. But with a dot, we can access a property on this auth context object that contains a component. And that's the provider. Auth context provider is a component we can use in our JSX code, and we can wrap it around other components. And those other components and all their descendant components, so all their children and their children's children and so on, all those components will now have access to that context. Now, since we use auth context as a wrapper here, we can now technically also use React fragment because we got this wrapping component as a root level component I return here. And with that, the main header, but also the login and the home component and all their children will have access to auth context. So now we provide this. Now we have the second part, and that is the listening part. To get access to our value, which at the moment is always just this default value, which never changes. We're going to work on that too, of course. But to have access to that value, we need to listen. And we can listen in two ways. We can listen by using auth context consumer or by using a React hook. Now, we'll typically use the React hook, but let me show you the other alternative to consumer as well. Let's say here in navigation, we're interested in knowing whether the user is authenticated or not. For that, we can also use auth context there and wrap everything where we need data from it with that consumer. So here, for example, we could wrap the entire component with auth context. Again, make sure to import it, of course. Dot consumer now. Previously, we had the provider. Now we have the consumer. The consumer works a bit differently, though. The consumer takes a child, which actually should be a function between curly braces like this. And as an argument, you'll get your context data. So in our case, you'll get this object here. And then in this function, you should return your JSX code, which should have access to that data. So here I'm grabbing all that nav code, I'm returning that. And in there, I now, for example, have access to ctx.isLoggedIn because my context object is this object here, and there I have the isLoggedIn prop. Now, if you save that, you will, however, see, if you reload, that this crashes. And the reason for that is that we do have a default value here, but this default value will actually only be used if we would consume here without having a provider. So technically the provider is not even needed. However, you should memorize this pattern I explained earlier where you need the provider. Technically, you don't need it if you have a default value, but in reality, you will use context to have a value which can change, and that will only be possible with a provider. So therefore, to make sure that this does not crash, let's go back to the provider. And there, on the provider component, you can add a value prop. And this has to be named value because this is not a component by you. And to that, you can also pass your object. So in this case, I will just repeat my default object here. But now you would be able to change that object, for example, through state in the app component. And whenever it changes, the new value will be passed down to all consuming components. But that is something I will also come back to in a second. So here, let me save this, and now it reloads without problems. Now, of course, if I now log in, you will see that we only have one link here. So that first link, the user's link, is missing because there I'm pulling data from my context, and that at the moment is never changing. So let's make sure we can change it before I then show you the alternative to the consumer. Here, changing it is easy. We have set up the provider here in the app component, and there we manage the isLoggedIn state anyways. So instead of hard coding our isLoggedIn value in the value we pass to the provider, we can set it to isLoggedIn, of course. And if we do that, this value object will be updated by React whenever isLoggedIn changed. And that new object, that new context object, will be passed down to all listening components. So to all components where we consume this context. The difference to before is that we don't need to use a prop to forward that, therefore. Instead, we just set it on the provider, and then everywhere in all child components, we can listen to that. So here we could remove the isAuthenticated prop on the main header, and in the main header, therefore, stop forwarding it to the navigation. And in navigation, we could now use context.isLoggedIn everywhere where we need the isLoggedIn information. And that's now where we break up that props chain, where we stop forwarding that data, which we don't need in the main header, and where we instead leverage context. So now if I reload, you see that still works, and now the link is back, but now we're using context here. Now I did mention, however, that the consumer is just one way of consuming our context. It's an okayish way, but I don't like that syntax too much, having that function that then returns our code. You can do that, but there actually is a more elegant way, a more elegant solution using the useContext hook. So let's explore the useContext hook. For that here, I will actually remove this code. I will remove the consumer like this. And therefore I'm back to my old navigation component, but of course now I'm referring to that CTX object, which simply doesn't exist anymore. Now we're still importing auth context, and we can use it again now by importing a hook from React, and that's the use context hook. Another hook that's built into React. And it does what the name implies. It allows us to use the context. It allows us to tap into a context and listen to it. Using it is simple. You call useContext in your React component function, and you pass the context, a pointer at the context you want to use, to it. So in our case, I'm pointing to auth context. Now what you get back is the context value. So here, I'll store this in a CTX constant to make my code down there work again. And with that, we can save this, and it will again work just fine, simply because I'm using the use context hook. Easy like that, simple like that. This is all we need to do, and this, of course, I would say is a bit more elegant and a bit nicer than using auth context consumer, which you, however, just to make this clear, are also allowed to use. It's not wrong or anything like that. This is just a bit more elegant, in my opinion. So we're using useContext to pass the isLoggedIn state to my other components here. That's great, but of course you will notice that we're still forwarding the onLogout prop or the logout handler function through props, and that's of course still not ideal. It would be nicer if we could use the main header like this, so without passing any data to it, because we don't need to forward onLogout. But of course at the moment this would not work. This would mean at the moment that we're simply not able to log out because we're not passing our logout handler. So hammering the logout button here in the navigation wouldn't do anything. The good thing is we can set up a dynamic context where we don't just pass data to our components, but also functions, which technically of course also is data, but still you get my point. Here all we need to do is in our auth context provider, where we set up the value, besides passing down isLoggedIn, we can also pass down, let's say, onLogout, where we point at the logout handler. Just like this. If I do that, and make sure you don't execute it, you just want to point at the function. If I do that, then every listening component, every component that listens to auth context will be able to utilize logout handler here, simply through the onLogout context value. So therefore, back in navigation, where we are referring to props onLogout, we can now simply do CTX onLogout. And this will work because on the context object, we now have the onLogout value. So if we save that, now logging out works again. And of course, the rest of the app also works just fine, as you can tell. So this now all works, again, with the help of context, where you can not just pass down values like strings, objects, and so on, but where you can also pass down functions. And therefore, now we're using this app-wide or component-wide context object to manage our state and to manage the function that changes the state. Hence, we don't need props in the navigation component anymore, and we can remove it. And you now have a great example for using context. Now here in my main section here, I will still pass down the logout handler through onLogout and the login handler through onLogin because I directly use those handlers in the login and home components. You see in the login component, we directly refer to props onLogin. We're not forwarding it, we're using it here. And the same in the home component. I'm directly using onLogout here. Sure, we're technically forwarding it to our own button component, but this is a pure presentational component. And this here is actually fine. I don't want to use context inside of my button to always bind button clicks to onLogout, because whilst this would remove the need to pass onLogout like this, it would also mean that our button is now always logging the user out and not able to do anything else upon a click. And this also shows you when to use props and when to use context. In most cases, you will use props to pass data to components, because props are your mechanism to configure components and to make them reusable. Only if you have something which you would forward through a lot of components and you're forwarding it to a component that does something very specific, like for example the navigation, where this button will always log the user out. In such cases, you want to consider context. And as with everything in programming, with more experience, it will also of course become clearer and more natural when to use what. You can of course always rely on prop chains if you prefer that, but context allows you to write more concise code, and it often makes managing such app-wide state simply a bit easier. Now, a little enhancement to our context. It is a good idea to also add your functions, like onLogout in my case, to the default context when you create the context. And there you can just store a dummy function which does nothing. I'm doing this for better IDE auto-completion, because you will see that if I don't have this here, in the navigation component, here if I try to call onLogout, I'm not getting any suggestion by my IDE. It doesn't know that there is an onLogout prop. On the other hand, you will see that there is this isLoggedIn suggestion. Now that's simply happening because the way React works and the way Visual Studio Code at least works, it's looking at this default context object to find out what you are able to access on your context. So for better IDE auto-completion, it is a good idea to add onLogout here in your default context object as well, just with a dummy function, because we're not going to use this anyways. And then here, you will see that now I get this onLogout auto-completion. So that's just a tiny hint you might consider because it can be helpful. Another thing that you might consider is, depending on your application structure and how you're managing your data, you also might want to pull more logic out of, for example, app component and create a separate context management component, if you want to call it like this. How could this look like? Well, maybe in our auth context store file, we could create a auth context provider component now actually, where we return auth context.provider, and we accept props and simply pass whatever we got on props children between our provider. And then here, I don't just export auth context as the default, but I also export my auth context provider in addition to the default as a named export. Now, why am I doing that? Because now we can actually also import useState here inside of the auth context.js file and manage the isLoggedIn state and set isLoggedIn here inside of this auth context provider. Add the logout handler function here, where I set isLoggedIn to false, and also add the login handler function here now, so that we manage the entire authentication state in this separate provider component. And here I set isLoggedIn to true, of course. And then I set the value here, of course, to an object where I have isLoggedIn, which is equal to the isLoggedIn state, where I have onLogout, which points at the logout handler, and in addition, where we now also have onLogin, which points at the login handler. And therefore, I will also add this to my default context here, onLogin, with a dummy function, just making it clear that we there want the email and a password. We're not doing anything with that data, but technically we would need it in a real app. And now we have this standalone file which manages the entire login state in this auth context provider component, and which also sets up all the context. And the advantage here could be, and I'm saying could because this is something you can consider, it always depends on your preferences, the exact use case, and the size of your app, but this is something you could consider because now we can strip that all out of app component. We of course also though need to move over our local storage access here. So clear data in the logout handler, set our data in the login handler, and of course also add our use effect code here. That all now needs to go into our auth context provider, and therefore we also need to import use effect here. But with that all, we can now clear all that logic here from the app component, remove these hook imports here, remove our auth context import here, remove all of that, and therefore, of course, bring back React fragment like this. And I'm doing this because now we can wrap the app component as a whole, so therefore an index component, which is where we render the app component, with auth context provider. So with our auth context provider component, which we just created and exported in the auth context file. And with that, we have one central place for the state management, for the auth state management, I should say. And that central place is now not the app component, but a dedicated context component and a dedicated context file. And this might be a structure you might prefer because it is more focused and gives you a leaner app component, which now is not concerned with app-wide state management, but which now instead can just focus on, well, bringing something onto the screen. Of course, since I'm now using isLoggedIn here, I need to be able to get that information. So now in the app component, we want to use context and pass our auth context, not the provider, but still the auth context object, which is our default export in the auth context file. And therefore, we now got our context here as well, and hence we can access it here. And now we could even remove the onLogin and onLogout props here, because we're not managing the logout and login handlers in app component anyways. And now tap into context in the home and login components. So in the home component, we can now also import use context and get access to our auth context, maybe to mix up the naming and make it clear what's in there, to which context we're listening here, by importing auth context and passing it to use context. Again, use auth context here, not the provider. And then here we can use auth ctx.onLogout and do something similar in the login component. Import use context here. And then in our component function, maybe here, we can set up our auth context by calling use context and passing auth context to it. For that, make sure you are importing auth context, of course. And then we can use auth context when we need to log in. So here it's not props on login, but auth ctx on login, to which we forward the email and password. Now, again, this is totally optional. The advantage here could just be that you have a leaner app component, which again is now just focused on returning JSX and bringing something onto the screen, and you have the actual auth state management and auth context management all in one file. And some developers, including myself, often prefer this more focused and separated approach, where you have components where every component has one job essentially and not a ton of jobs. And therefore I'm a fan of this split, but as so often it's not the only way of doing this, and it's also not the only correct way. It's definitely a practice that is worth looking into though, a practice you might see in projects out there, and therefore something that of course needs to go into a course like this, which has the job of turning you into a real React developer. And therefore you have to know patterns like this, which is why we refactored this. With all of that out of the way, let's test our application to ensure that this still works. And that all seems to work to me here. Let's also check the logout button here. Yeah, that all works now with one central context, with one central state management. So React context is great. Let's use it for everything. Well, not quite. For one, keep in mind what I mentioned earlier. It can be great for app-wide or component-wide state, so essentially state that affects multiple components. It's not a replacement for component configuration. Consider our button here in the UI folder. The button should be reusable. Sure, we could use context to make sure that upon a click we always log the user out, but that would mean that we can't use the button for anything else than logging users out. And that might not be what you want. For example, in this application, we are using the same button component in the login component to log the user in and trigger the form submission, as well as we're using it in the home component to log the user out. So that is a scenario where using context in the button component would be bad. You want to use props here to configure the button. So props for configuration, context for state management across components or possibly across the entire app. But even then, we have limitations. React context is specifically not optimized for high frequency changes. So that means, for example, if you have state changes every second or multiple times per second, this is clearly not the case in our example here. For authentication, that does not change that often. It changes once every few minutes in reality, maybe not even that. So that is a perfect use case for context. But if you had state changes that happen much more frequently, again, talking about multiple changes per second and so on, then React context is not optimized for that. And you don't have to take this from me. This is actually something that was stated by an official React team member. So it's not great for high frequency changes. Now you might wonder, okay, but what if I have app-wide or component-wide state that changes often? I would want to use context for that. Props might not be ideal, and you're telling me that it's bad. We'll explore a better tool for that later, no worries. It will be called Redux, and I'll have a whole section on it. And as I mentioned, it should not be used to replace all component communications and props. Props are still vital and important for component configuration. So you should still use props for that and not use context for everything. For replacing long prop chains, it might, however, be worth a look. So now in this module, we learned a lot of important new concepts and we learned about new React hooks. Specifically, we can see it here in the login component. We knew about useState before, but now we also learned about useEffect, useReducer, and also useContext. So there are a bunch of React hooks. There are even more hooks than that, but we'll get there step by step. Now that we have all those hooks, it is important that we also learn about some rules for using them. We always followed those rules thus far, because of course I'm not teaching you incorrect patterns, but I think it's now also time to give you a formal definition which you can print out, put on your wall, and make sure you don't violate them. You find this slide attached therefore. Side note, all slides are always attached to the last lecture of each module. Anyways, there are two main rules you have to know when it comes to working with React hooks. And React hooks are simply all those functions that start with use. So useEffect, useReducer, and so on. The first rule, which is important, is that you must only call React hooks in React functions. That means in React component functions, as we did it thus far, or also allowed in custom hooks. That's not something we explored yet, but of course that will also be included in this course. Just as the name suggests, it's a bit more complex and therefore a bit more advanced, and something we'll therefore dive in later. These are the two scenarios where you are allowed to use React hooks. And what does this mean? Well, to give you a concrete example, here in the login component, we, for example, have the email reducer function. This is a function next to the login function. The login function here, however, is my component function for the login component. And it identifies itself as such a function because it returns JSX in the end. That is what makes up a component function. Email reducer does not do that. It returns an object. It's not a React component, and therefore calling useState in here is not allowed. And the good thing is, a modern React setup with a good IDE like Visual Studio Code will even tell you about that. You see it down there. React hook useState is called in function email reducer, which is neither a React function component or a custom React hook function. So exactly what I stated on the slide. You're only allowed to use hooks in React function components or in custom hooks. Email reducer is neither of that, and hence we get an error. So you should get an error if you try to do that, should get a warning, and here is also your technical rule: don't do it. The second important rule is that you must only call React hooks at the top level of your React component functions or your custom hook functions. Don't call hooks in nested functions. Don't call them in any block statements. So again, to give you an example, here in the login component, so now inside of the functional component, we of course, for example, have our useEffect function here. So the function which we pass to useEffect. You're not allowed to call useContext or useState or any other hook in there. Again, you will see I get a warning here. React hook useContext cannot be called inside a callback. React hooks must be called in a React function component or a custom React hook function, and it needs to be called directly on the top level there. So calling it here is okay, because that's the top level of this login function, but in a nested function is not allowed. And that's not just true for nested functions, it would also not be allowed in an if statement. Calling useState in there, also not allowed. So again, a very simple rule, not too hard to follow. Only call React hooks at the top level. Now these are the two official rules of hooks. There is a third rule which I want to add here, not directly related to all hooks, but to one specific hook. And that's the useEffect hook. There, make sure that you always add everything you refer to inside of useEffect as a dependency, unless there is a good reason not to do that, I should add. And to make it clear what I mean, let's again go to login component. In here, we use useEffect to execute this function, and in there, we use nothing from the surrounding component. We use console log, but that's baked into the browser. I'm not talking about browser API things. I'm talking about data exposed by the surrounding function. And here we're not using any data, hence we have no dependencies. It's a different thing for this useEffect here though. There we have this function, and in there we're using setTimeout, which is a browser API. You don't need to add those. But we are using email is valid and password is valid. And that's data from the surrounding component. That's part of the surrounding component's state. And if it would be part of the surrounding component's props, the same would be true. So what I'm now saying would be true in that case as well. Such dependencies or such values need to be added as dependencies. Technically, we should therefore also add setForm is valid, because that's not a browser API. But this is one exception to that rule actually. The state updating functions exposed by useReducer or by useState are guaranteed by React to never change, and therefore you don't need to add them as dependencies, because if they never change, well, it's a redundant dependency. You could add it though. Wouldn't be wrong, wouldn't be horrible. You could add it and it would work in the same way. You are just allowed to omit it. And actually, you don't need to memorize all of that if you think, well, that's too much. No worries. If I remove a dependency here, in a modern setup, you should get a warning here that React hook useEffect has a missing dependency. Either include it or remove the dependency array. So you are warned here as well, and I just want to explain this warning and why you are getting it. There are some exceptions, like the state updating functions, but all the other data, which is not coming from the browser or from outside your component function, so all the data that is from inside your component function in which you are using useEffect needs to go into the dependency array. That's my third rule here. And with that, you are well prepared to use hooks and to build amazing apps. Now let's continue on that road.